Greetings, metaphysicians. This is episode 141, How to Talk to God. And of course, there is no one way to talk to God. And don't worry if you're not a person who uses the word God. We are using that as a catch-all for the divine presence that is organizing and running this creation. So stay tuned, and we have some excellent bonus content as well after the episode. Enjoy.
You are listening to Let's Get Metaphysical. This podcast explores the spiritual and metaphysical world through the experiences and opinions of the host and those interviewed. It should not necessarily be seen as direct endorsement or personal advice to our listeners. We encourage you to use your own discernment, judgment, and intuition regarding anything you learn from this show.
Let's get meta.
Welcome to the Let's Get Metaphysical podcast. I'm your host, Renata Maniaci, here to remind you that you are a spiritual being having a temporary human experience here on lovely planet Earth as she goes through this transition period. Lots of evolution happening these days, but we can make the most of it. This is Season 7, Heaven on Earth, and this is Episode 141, How to Talk to God. And by God, I mean whatever you view as the supreme source, the divinity, the all that is, the creator, all these names that we use for this thing that is organizing all of this creation. And I definitely do not pretend to know how to talk to God. I'm here to offer some of my own experiences and see if any guidance comes through for probably the zillions of different ways to communicate with God or the divine or source, or however you feel that presence, however you know that presence. So let's jump right in, shall we? Are you ready? Let's get meta. Masters and angels, I request your presence, guidance, and support through this episode. Please help these words to be useful to all listeners on their evolutionary journey. Let me know the truth, speak the truth, become the truth, and be the truth. And please let this episode reach whoever needs to hear it. Thank you with gratitude and full faith. Bless creation. So while we start here, I just want to again reiterate, I'm no expert at communicating with God or the divine. I do it a lot, but that doesn't make me an expert. And there's not only one way to do this. And actually, what I wanted to start off by sharing is that I don't usually, my go-to is not to talk to what we would think of as God or the source. I am much more used to and likely to communicate with what I refer to as my angelic team. Those masters and angels that are specifically around me and probably omnipresent around several other beings on this planet, maybe hundreds of millions at the same time, but those beings are who I am used to talking to. And when I make requests or prayers or need to have a question answered, I am 99%, I'm just used to asking my angels. And so this episode is coming from a moment I had several days ago when I actually decided to talk to God instead. Something unusual for me. And that experience is what prompted me to have an episode about this specific topic. I've had episodes about how to communicate with your angels, You hear me making requests at the beginning of every episode, and I refer to my masters and angels, or the masters and angels. But this one's unique because I think a lot of people around the world do talk directly to God, but it is unusual for me. And I just wanted to share what it was like for me and reflect on some instances that have brought me to this point and some insights that came in while I had this experience to hopefully make it easier for you all to communicate with God if you feel like you need help with that. Hopefully you don't. Hopefully you have a wonderful relationship with the divine. I'm sure most of you do. And you can easily talk to your angels, your guides, your high self. Some of you are very accomplished at talking to people who have passed. I met a new friend recently who is a medium on some level, and I've met lots of people like this. I've had people like that on the podcast, but we had a great conversation. It was interesting because she was telling me how that started for her and how easy it is for her to communicate with humans who have passed, right? I don't have that gift. Sometimes in moments, I have been able in unique situations to connect with somebody who has just passed, who's a close friend of mine. This happened last summer, for example. But that's not normal for me, and it's normal for her. And what's normal for me is communicating with my angels or my angelic team, and that's not normal for her. So it's so interesting, the different levels of connection with the different levels of consciousness, the different levels of beingness, the different levels of dimensions even. You know, I would say that maybe those who have passed are on a different vibrational frequency than, let's say, the angelic kingdom. So maybe that's why I don't have access. Maybe I don't have access to that domain, that frequency that she does, so she can talk to people who have passed, right? These are all just speculations, but it seems to make sense. And so the other day, I was watching the sunset. And right now I'm in Costa Rica, and I often watch sunset from my little home here because I can have a pretty good view from my porch. But on this particular day, I was watching sunset surrounded by nature. I was actually in a pool by myself. Nobody else was around, and I had a clear shot. It was like the pool, then nature, like trees, the ground, the dirt, and then the beach, and then the ocean, and then the sunset. So there was no buildings in my vision like there usually is if I'm watching sunset from my own porch here. And I started having this really incredible experience, and I guess I could say information or insights coming in, and I just naturally felt like I wanted to talk to God as opposed to talking to my angelic team, as opposed to talking to my high self, that part of me that is immortal, that soul self, right? And I did, and it was very easy. And I find it very easy to talk to my angels. That's not difficult. When I talk to them, I hear them immediately, not with my ears, but it's kind of like internal, like knowing. I can hear them through my mind, or however some people call it, claircognizance. And that's always been easy for me. But as I said, talking to God is not something that I've usually gone for naturally. And so I just started, and God talked back, and we were having a conversation. And maybe it's different for everyone. I'm sure it is. But for me, there wasn't a specific voice, right? It wasn't like a masculine voice or a feminine voice. It was just kind of how when I've communicated with animals, we've talked about animal communication on this podcast, or when we talk about how they communicate telepathically, it's like that. So it doesn't come in the form of a voice, in the sense that like I have a feminine sounding voice, right? Or somebody else has a deep voice or a high pitched voice or whatever. That's not how it was to me, which is very much the same as the angels. But it was the same. It was as though we were just having a conversation, and I got the response just naturally, easily in my head. And one of the things I noticed at first is, wow, this is easy. This is just as easy as talking to my angelic teams. I wonder why I don't do this more often. Like, why do I not choose to communicate directly with God? And that's a whole thing that I can unpack later. I didn't really go into it, but, I'm wondering like, oh, do I think God's too busy to talk to me? Things like this. So we don't need to unpack that. But it was interesting in that one thing that really dropped in very obviously during these few minutes that was happening is that this was easy. This was easier, not necessarily for God, but for me to connect with, whatever we think of as God, all of creation, right? Because I was surrounded by God's creation, especially within my vision and senses. So I didn't see any other buildings. And even though I was in a pool, I was in water, which is God's creation. I was looking at the trees and the rocks and the dirt and the beach and the sand and the ocean and the sunset, and even feeling the water and feeling the wind and hearing the rustling of the leaves in the trees, and the waves, of course, which is all God's creation, right? These are things that were created by the divine source, that was created by the all that is. Any of these names that resonate with you. For some of us, the word God does not resonate. For me, the word God did not resonate for a very long time, which was due not by any fault to God, but by humanly constructed religion. And that's a whole nother episode, that's a whole nother story. But just to say that I understand that some of you listening to this don't resonate with the word God. So don't attach to that. Use the thing, the name, the word, the essence for you that does resonate, because you're listening to this podcast because on some level you are spiritual, you seek spirituality, you know that there's something more than just this mundane, humanly constructed world that we live in, right? So if God is the word that does not resonate with you, you replace it with the word that does resonate. And I just wanted to throw that out there. But back to what I was saying is that the overwhelming insight that dropped in is this is easier because I'm surrounded by God's creation. And this maybe is not so revolutionary of an insight, right? So many people, humans, beings on this planet have experienced more spiritual experiences when in nature. So it's not like this is revolutionary thinking, but when you hear a song 1,000 times and you love the song, you know all the words, and then on the 1,001st time, it's like you're hearing it for the very first time. Like you actually hear the words, you actually understand the meaning of it. This happened to me once while I was driving from, where was I driving from? When I was driving, I believe, from Arizona to Encinitas. It was a long trip, and I was listening to Rent, which is a musical that I listen to a lot. And there's a song on there, Another Day, that was my favorite song from the musical Rent. And I remember listening to it. I'd listened to it 1,000 times at least. And that one time, I actually finally heard the words and felt deeply their true meaning. And I started crying, and I could not, for the longest time, listen to that song without crying. After listening to it for a decade or more and singing to it for a decade or more, right? So I'm using that example as a kind of metaphor for what happened to me a few days ago when I was in nature talking to God and having this realization that, oh my gosh, this is easier because I'm in God's creation. It's kind of like, duh, that makes sense, but I really felt it. I really understood it. Whereas, let's say when I'm watching the sunset on my porch, I'm on humanly constructed flooring, building. I'm sitting in a chair that was made by humans. I'm seeing buildings in front of me that are human constructs, right? And yes, we all have God or source or any of these words, right? Whatever you resonate with inside us. We all have that. So on some level, God is in everything that we have created. That is true, right? Our clothing, our shelves, our books, our buildings, anything. There is part of God in the things that humans have constructed because God is present in all humans. So that is yes, right? Yes. And there was something about being away from all those humanly constructed things and only seeing, feeling, hearing, etc., these things and stimuli that were created directly by God. And it amplified. It's like, if I got a 1G connection, is that even a thing? I don't even know. A 1G connection to phone line, internet, Wi-Fi, whatever, to God when I'm in a building, I got a 5G connection to God being surrounded by nature. It was like the line was clear. It was a faster connection, a bigger connection, an easier connection, all of that. I'm obviously not a techie because I could be using words that make more sense, but you understand the meaning. It was like there was nothing in the way. Nothing was in the way of that communication. And again, maybe not again, but what just dropped in also is that watching the sunset or the sunrise specifically, the sun, I'll say this, I don't believe that we as humans fully understand the divine purposes, the divine, what would the words be? Maybe we'll use purpose. We don't fully understand the divine purpose of our sun, okay? We really only understand some of the physics, characteristics, and purposes of our sun, but I really don't think that we understand fully the spiritual and divine purposes for our star. And maybe it's the same for every other solar system that has a star or a multi-star system or whatever. Yes, sure, it provides light and heat, and without it, we would be no more, right? We need that on a physical level. I believe that there's much more divinity about the sun than we know, and I don't pretend to know what that is. It just feels like it is way more significant. Maybe it's a portal. Maybe it emanates divine energies, frequencies, vibrations on levels that are beyond the physical that we still need to survive, that we also need besides just the physical light and heat. Maybe it's providing things we have no idea about. Maybe all life emanates from the sun. Maybe God exists in the sun at a bigger, maybe that's the closest that we get to see God is as a representation of the sun. I don't know, right? Speculation, but still, the idea or insight, whatever you want to call it, did drop in during that time that just because I was watching the sunset, and it could have been the sunrise, I also had a closer connection to God because of the sun, because the sun was part of that experience as well. Now, that's all to say that being in nature, being surrounded by things that are created by the divine and not necessarily created by humans, can absolutely help us in connecting with the divine without interference, without humanly constructed interference in terms of even our building materials, right? Divinity conducts through nature, I believe, and I have experienced, more easily than humanly constructed things, right? Like divinity is easier for me to feel through a tree or through the ground or through the ocean than it is through concrete, through plastic, through tile, through things that we have created. I'm not saying these things are bad, they're not. But it makes sense that you would be able to feel, experience, resonate more with the divine, with things that were divinely constructed, divinely created, right? And it made me remember various times throughout my life that I've had what I would call very spiritual, spiritual is such a funny word, right? Like, I'm so spiritual. Like, I don't mean it like that, but things that bring you out of the physical, right? So this podcast is Let's Get Metaphysical. Experiences that are metaphysical in nature. Not physical in nature, metaphysical in nature. We could call that spiritual, we could call that metaphysical. So experiences that I've had that are more metaphysical in nature, not of the physical, right? More of the divine, have almost universally happened in nature. I remember, especially the first times, especially when I had no idea about any of this stuff. I wasn't a scholar. I wasn't reading spiritual books. I wasn't part of a religion. I wasn't necessarily overtly seeking God or looking for God. I was just living my life. Now, I have friends who read Autobiography of a Yogi when they were 12. This was part of their path long before it was part of mine, right? Seekers from the very beginning. It wasn't my path. I needed to have a pretty fully humanly surrounded and constructed life up until around 25, 28 before I could focus on this stuff for whatever reason. But when I first started having metaphysical experiences, they were all when I was outside. And that's obvious maybe to some, but it just dropped in, like hearing that song for the first time, like hearing the words for the first time. Oh my gosh. All of these experiences, these first really poignant, made me think about something other than just human, worldly, material, everything. How we live our lives, the just normal blah, blah, blah of being a human on earth. The first experiences I had outside of the physical, in the metaphysical realms, all happened when I was fully in nature. I remember being on a canoe trip in the Boundary Waters when I was in my, let's say, 15 or 16, and needing to wake up in the middle of the night to go out and pee, and just looking up and seeing the stars. It brings tears to my eyes just even remembering that experience, because there was no humanly constructed anything except for like our tents, and the canoe itself, whatever. But no buildings, no noise pollution, no phone lines, no airplanes, no anything except God's creation. And I didn't know what to do with that. I remember feeling verklempt like I am now, and kind of in wonder, in awe of what I was seeing. Did I equate it to God in any way? Did I equate it to the divine in any way? No, I didn't. Not at that time. I knew it was special. I knew I loved the way I felt in nature. I know still that when I go on canoe trips that are away from any other humanly constructed anything, such as the Boundary Waters, such as Quetico Provincial Park in Canada, anywhere, I feel amazing. I know that. I know that one of the most powerful metaphysical experiences I had after that, I was 21 and in Senegal, and I've talked about this a couple different times on the podcast, I'm sure, throughout the last 5 years, but I had a moment walking down from a mountain and only seeing God's creation around me, only seeing that, and just having this overwhelming sense of wonder and like knowing, feeling with every cell in my body the divine, that this was somehow the creation, the source. This was all cosmically, divinely orchestrated. And at that time, I could not say the word God. I was not there. I did not resonate with that word yet. That's fine. If you don't, you do. It's all, but I knew that that existed. That's doesn't really matter what you call it. You know it was something bigger than yourself. I knew that I did not create this creation, that something beyond me, above me, all around me created this creation, and that I was just super grateful to be able to be part of it and to observe it. And that all happened surrounded completely by nature. So what's the point? The point is there's so many different ways to communicate with God, to communicate with the divine, and I hope that you already have those ways for you. But if you need some help, if you need some tips, here's the big one from this episode. Be surrounded by God's creation and then communicate with that creator. Try it. You have nothing to lose. And it could come in differently. You could actually hear a voice. You could actually see signs of a response. You could, anything, right? There's so many different ways to receive information, or you could just know, like me, you could just have the conversation telepathically in your head. And that's what it is. And you know that it's not you, and you know it's not your mind or your ego because it happens quickly and you couldn't have thought of those answers. And maybe you ask a question and you get a response that you don't necessarily like. When that happens, you know it's not you. If you get a response to a question you're asking and it's not the exact answer that you want, that's not you. So as usual, go ahead and try. And we will have bonus content for this episode today, a clearing on anything getting in the way of you communicating with God, with you communicating with the divine on all levels. That can be external things and being in specific places. Maybe you're living in New York City surrounded by cement and you can't get into nature. Or maybe you have subconscious belief systems and attachments that are preventing you from believing or knowing. It's more like knowing that you can communicate with God. You can communicate with the divine. That's what the bonus content is about today. We are doing a clearing on that. You can replay it as much and as many times as you want. You can access that at patreon.com/letsgetmeta. As always, and then you have access to every other bonus content I've ever done, which is well over 100, I think, at this point. And then you can leave. You can stay part of that little community we have on there of patron angels for a month and leave, or you can stay for a few months and then leave. And you're helping the podcast to continue if you choose that that's something that you want to do. So I'm going to leave it there for today. As always, thank you so much for listening. Stay positive, stay safe, and stay meta.
The Let's Get Metaphysical podcast is an Up and Awaken production and is produced and hosted by Renata Maniaci. Our intention is to raise the vibration of the planet by sharing, validating, and normalizing spiritual and metaphysical experiences. If you are ready to raise your vibration, you might enjoy our free Let's Get Meta Master Clearing. To receive the Master Clearing or to learn more about the podcast, visit letsgetmeta.com. The Let's Get Meta podcast is inspired by angels and supported by angels. If you would like to be a patron angel to the podcast, visit patreon.com/letsgetmeta. Thank you for listening. Stay meta.
Let's get meta. Metaphysical. Let's get meta. Metaphysical. Let's get meta. Metaphysical. Let's get meta. Metaphysical.